So we must do two things, two great things together, to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself. So let's just take a little time now to build up this textbook matrix. We said that it is from the two levels of absolute Christian Science and Christian Science. These two levels then give to the indices their values, their tone, their pedal note. We want to talk about the pedal note of absolute Christian Science in the textbook matrix. We see that that pedal note goes all across the top of the matrix and qualifies or defines the epitomes for the columns in the matrix, So the columns are those four that run vertically. So we have four from the standpoint of the Word that run vertically, four from the standpoint of the Christ that run vertically, four from the standpoint of Christianity, giving us the vertical column of Christianity, or the vertical of Christianity. We refer to it in all those ways. And then fourthly, the four that run vertically and show us what science is. These are the values that run across the top, and the values that run across the left-hand side belong to two indices. Index I, being the top index, is from the standpoint of absolute Christian Science. Index J, including all of those values that run along the left-hand side, are from the standpoint of Christian Science. So we really have two indices, don't we? Two indexes, an I and a J, absolute Christian Science and Christian Science. Then we see that at each point, the point of the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science, we have the values for that particular index. So that at the point of index I, you have the values of the Word as the revelation of God's nature, the Christ as the translation of God to idea, Christianity as the realm of ideas, and science as principle and idea is one. Then as we move down to the J index, we see that we have four values that belong to the J index. First, from the point of view of the Word as the accepting of the proposition. Then the Christ, the power of manifestation in spite of error. Christianity, exalted being. And science, scientific understanding. So with those two indices, in other words, with 8 values then, those 8 values interrelate with each other and bring out 16 unique standpoints. So you have in the I index the Word as the revelation of God's nature, and that relates to the J index, first as the Word as accepting the revelation of God's nature, as the Christ, as the power of the manifestation of God's nature, of that revelation of God's nature in spite of any error. Then at Christianity, that the revelation of God's nature brings forth an exalted sense of being. And finally, the Word as science, scientific understanding, that God's nature, the revelation of God's nature, brings about scientific understanding. So can you see how they relate to each other? And when you draw all of the conclusions of the two indices in relationship, you have the 16 points of intersection. So let us quickly go through those 16 points, and we will not belabor them, but it will give us a tonality for the context of the platform from the standpoint of absolute and Christian science. So the textbook begins, and it begins really with our approach to God, our approach to being. And it begins at the point of the Word as the Word, and this is depicted through the chapter Prayer. It's the revelation of God's nature to us and the accepting of God's nature. Prayer is that chapter in which you have all of the qualities, the spiritual qualities, the mental qualities, everything that is necessary for an ordered approach to God is presented in prayer. And we see that the epitome there for the chapter is that the revelation of God's nature is, I always stumble on this one because it's actually stated that God's nature is revealed by our accepting God's nature within us, but actually may be the other way around. I think that's why I always stumble a little bit, because it's so that God's nature is revealing and revealing itself and causes us to accept that nature as our own nature, that we begin to see that we have the nature of God, and then it becomes, the whole thing becomes cybernetic and feeds back on itself, because the moment I see that I have God's nature and I accept that, I receive more of the revelation of God's nature. And that causes me to see that I have God's nature and the moreness of it, what that quality is, and it grows and grows and grows. So we already touch that cybernetic sense right with the first chapter, that God's nature is revealing itself to us, and that we have that nature, that we could not recognize, we could not know that nature if it were not already our own. So at the cornerstone really of the textbook, it is that which equips us then to move on, or to be moved on. We are moved on by the dynamic of the calculus. You see, that's what we're looking at, the calculus, a 4x4 calculus matrix, which is showing us that our own evolution towards scientific understanding is calculus driven by the 4. So the revelation of God's nature from absolute Christian science comes to Christian science, and I accept that nature. As I accept that nature, I find that that revelation just is continually coming. It doesn't stop, but that it makes demands on me. And so a further step is urging itself on us, and we become aware of the demands of the Christ, the demands to bring everything into coincidence with the Christ, to righten everything with the Christ, to reconcile our mind with the mind of God in order to be at one mind, or to have that at one ment, which is really the translated form, which when translated becomes the atonement. That's what she means by atonement. It's the chapter Atonement in Eucharist, and we see that behind our ability to atone or to come into oneness, into coincidence with the Christ, is our absolute at one-ment with God. So God's nature manifests itself in us, and it manifests itself in spite of anything that is unlike that nature. It begins to deal with anything that is unlike itself within us. This is the Christ. Then still in the Word we see that the revelation of God's nature has an outcome, that the Word and the Christ have an outcome. And so we come to the Word as Christianity, to the chapter Marriage. And in that chapter we see that we get the outcome or the exaltation of our being, that we see that God's nature begins to demonstrate itself in us as a higher humanhood or a higher sense of being, and begins to bring changes into our most down-to-earth and daily life experience. So it is raising up a higher humanhood. That's the outcome of the revelation of the divine nature within us. Then we come to the fourth chapter. Excuse me if I just say, and then we come to the fourth chapter. When I hear myself say that, I don't like it, because it isn't, and then we come to the fourth chapter. It's, and then we are divinely driven to the next standpoint. That's what I should be saying. That's what you should be hearing. Then we are divinely driven to the standpoint of the Word as science. We cannot stay in a higher sense of humanhood. You hear now how scientific this really is, because the human loves the outcome that it receives in the Word as Christianity. We love that outcome, and we would love to stay in that blessed and harmonious sense of humanhood. But we are not allowed to, because the nature of God is coming in from absolute Christian Science, from the Christ science, from that realm of the positive feedback, and is constantly working on us to say, no, 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 there's more. There's more. And you have to move on. You have to be dynamically driven on. And I do that. I do that for you. And the human cannot decide to do that. But it is in the divine calculus. And so we come to, there it is again, and so we come. But now you know what it means. So we come to the fourth chapter, to Christian Science versus Spiritualism, and it is that chapter which causes us to really come to grips with the reality of being, that reality is spirit. So the chapter is concerned with explaining to us what is real and what is unreal, declaring that spirit is the real and the only. And that chapter sets forth for us the scientific methods of understanding. It says this nature of God can be understood, and it must be understood. And so now I give you the methods in order to understand that. This is the climax, really, of the word vertical. Then we are taken over to the Christ vertical. Taken to the Christ. It's the Christ that is concerned with the translation of God to idea and wants to show us now how we are going to be retranslated, how our consciousness is being retranslated, how our understanding or our misunderstanding or our lack of understanding is being retranslated until we achieve a scientific sense of consciousness in the 8th chapter. So it takes those 4 chapters to show us how the translation of God to idea is working again on our scientific understanding. So in the 5th chapter is Animal Magnetism Unmasked, and she gives us there really the definition of the nature and operation of animal magnetism, of the Antichrist, really of the showing us, unmasking to us the nothingness of the claim that there is any other standpoint but the standpoint of the Word. That if we take the standpoint of the Word, animal magnetism is unmasked. It's unmasked as nothing. When you unmask it, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And so the Christ, which has always to do with the power inherent in the Word, is going to show us that if you take the standpoint of the Word, you have nothing but the power of the Christ working on you and with you, and that there is no other power. And so it's an ordered statement of the powerlessness and the nothingness of error. And we see that at the point of the Christ as the Word, it has to do with our accepting of that proposition, accepting that nothing is coming to me except God, that nothing can translate itself to me except God. And as I accept this Christ translation, the ungodlike is translated back into its native nothingness. And we come to chapter 6. And that's the chapter, Science, Theology, and Medicine, where the Christ translation begins to reveal the constituents, the true constituents of being. And we get the power of manifestation in spite of error, meaning that which looks like the false constituents of being, those false constituents of mortal mind, matter, sense, testimony, personal sense, etc., are retranslated back, are re-seen, are seen to be only the true constituents of being. And so she gives those constituents in that chapter. And this is, of course, the chapter where she portrays her discovery, her own way of discovery. We might think we would find this chapter at point 1 in the matrix, that she would begin by saying, well, in 1866 I discovered the laws of life, truth, and love, and name my discovery Christian Science. And if we were writing a book, I think we would be tempted to put that first and not put a chapter like prayer first. But actually, by putting those first 5 chapters first, she gave her own way of life. She showed what was her way of life and what is everybody's way of life. The textbook shows us our way of life, and it's the way that each of us goes. And then coming to that 6th standpoint, she can show us really the enormity of what she did discover as she presents those true constituents of being, and also in that chapter the Christ translation, the pattern for the Christ. Then there is an automatic movement, dynamic within the calculus that takes us to the Christ as Christianity. This is the chapter Physiology, and in this chapter we see that there is an outcome to the translation that has been going on, that the mortal sense of man is completely translated into the immortal sense, just as she provided, you see in chapter 6, the translation itself. And depicted in the two translations, a third degree as an ideal of what it would be if the mortal man were to disappear and immortal man in God's image and likeness were to appear. And we find that coming out or being accentuated in the 7th chapter of Physiology, where we have the effect of that translation, the translation of mortal man into immortal man. So it's the translation of a mortal into an immortal, and we get really the view of what we are as an immortal. Then the dynamic moves on from the Christ as Christianity to the Christ as science, and we come to chapter 8, to Footsteps of Truth, to that chapter which says, now this translation which is taking place and has taken place and is evolving you out of mortality and into immortality, where is that actually going on? It's going on in consciousness. It's an evolution of consciousness. It's a translation and a retranslation of consciousness. And that what is fundamentally happening from the standpoint of science is that there is a Christ translation that is translating your unscientific consciousness into the scientific consciousness, so that we see that we have followed precisely exactly how that translation of God to idea is first encountered as we accept it in Animal Magnetism Unmasked, then with its power of manifestation in spite of error in Science, Theology, and Medicine, then as bringing out an exalted sense of being as we begin to see what it is to leave the mortal for the immortal in Physiology, and as a fourth point, from the standpoint of scientific understanding, really bringing the whole issue to the question of science and to understanding and to consciousness. This is what science does, and says that actually all of those three are issues of a scientific consciousness versus an unscientific consciousness. It makes some sense, doesn't it? It makes a little bit of sense. So we are brought really to the point of divine consciousness, and with such a consciousness, we know that consciousness determines experience, and therefore with our new consciousness we begin to see a new universe. What kind of a universe does a scientific consciousness see? It sees the universe of ideas, the universe of the outcome of the translation of the Christ, the translation of God to idea, that translation which is infinite, which is eternal, which is unending and unlimited, effects itself or has the outcome, is pictured, is seen in the outcome of the realm of ideas, the infinite realm of ideas. And as our consciousness is structured scientifically, we become more aware of a universe of ideas. So in chapter 9, we see that it is Christianity as the Word, really to accept that proposition. What proposition? You see, every time it says accept the proposition, I can go right back up to my I index and see what it is I'm to accept. I have to accept the I index. So at the point of Christianity, I have to accept the realm of ideas. This is my natural response, my innate response, my scientific response to the impact of absolute Christian Science upon me. It's my response from the level of Christian Science. And so I do accept and can accept, not out of a moral effort now, but out of a translation that has taken place. Not out of trying to be good and do good and see good and to see no evil, but really out of the whole translatability process that has acted upon me in the Christ vertical. So I actually do begin to see a universe of ideas, a realm of ideas, and to accept that ideational universe as it reveals itself to me. That's what we have in the creation chapter, really the presenting of what the nature is of the universe of ideas, of what constitutes creation, and that true universe, that it is of the nature of idea, and that we can grasp this verse however meekly we may begin to do that. We do begin to do it, and as we do that, we are dropping off our mental swaddling clothes. All right, so we now have been brought by the calculus to the 10th point in the textbook matrix, to the chapter Science of Being. We are in the Christianity vertical, in the realm of ideas, and at the point of the Christ, where we see the power of the manifestation of ideas in spite of any error, in spite of illusions. This is precisely what the 10th chapter will show us, and it is showing us the dynamic power of ideas, of the manifestation of ideas, that ideas have a Christ, something we don't usually think about. We think that God has a Christ and the Christ is the Christ, but we seldom think that ideas have a Christ, that they must have a Christ because they reflect their Creator, they reflect the Word, and the Word has a Christ. And so we see in the 3 parts of that chapter how the dynamic power of manifestation of ideas is dissolving both latent and concrete error. We're going to come back to the 10th chapter and focus in on that very thing shortly. Then we see that there is an 11th standpoint, the standpoint of Christianity as Christianity, where it is the chapter Some Objections Answered. And here we see that the universe of ideas consists of infinite relationships of ideas which form one consistent whole, one coherent whole. And so Christianity is showing us that realm of ideas as an exalted state of being where all ideas are working together in one great universal operation. It's the perfect reflection of ideas which is exalting a theoretical sense of Christianity, a moral sense of Christianity, a human sense of Christianity, exalting us right out, exalting the whole universe right out of that false sense, that limited sense of Christianity, and into a practical Christianity, which is a reflection of pure idea. How is this practical? Christianity as science shows us that. It says that, yes, the realm of ideas is the most practical thing. It is the only practical thing for you. In fact, that a scientific understanding of ideas heals. And so we get a presentation of the conscious, practical application of this realm of ideas, and how an understanding, a knowledge of the nature of ideas and the dynamics of ideas is able to heal. Able to heal. And healing, again, is always a question of consciousness. Healing takes place in consciousness. So healing is a matter of our state of consciousness. As our consciousness is scientifically structured, as it approximates more and more the structure of being itself, we see that this is a healing process. This is healing going on. And that we don't have to take something and apply it to something else. Take the truth and apply it to a situation, to a body, to wonder how to take care of a body, how to fix a body. Everything is consciousness, and it's our consciousness. It starts with our consciousness. That as we are scientifically aligned with the structure of being, we are incapable of seeing anything that is not whole, that is not healthy. So we are brought by the conclusion of the Christianity vertical to the coming in of the science vertical, to the fact that principle and idea is one. This seems to have a very high standpoint, principle and idea one. We usually think of that as divine science, and it is divine science insofar as principle and its idea as a whole are one. This is divine science. If we have principle and idea is one on the level of absolute Christian Science, we know that absolute Christian Science is always showing us the relationship of principle to ideas, to individual ideas, to its individual ideas. So we see that the highest relationship that principle has to its idea, its ideas, is to be one with that idea. And so we see this oneness coming out in the science vertical. First by the chapter 13, the chapter on teaching Christian Science, which is very practical. It's bringing in a very practical sense, namely of how to accept the proposition that principle and its idea is one. How can I accept that? It shows the student how to adhere to the principle, that we must adhere and abide by the divine principle, and by so doing we become the scientist. We become a scientist, a principled idea. So it is how to be one with principle, and that by accepting our oneness with principle, we are principle idea. We would really see that that 13th chapter asks us to accept our oneness with the principle that we have seen through the first 12 chapters, the first 3 verticals, so that every new standpoint builds on what has gone before. And it's a crucial point at the place value of science as the word, because science as the word now is going to fall back on everything that we have seen in the word vertical, the Christ vertical, the Christianity vertical, and say, this is principle. This is principle. I am the principle. So accept your oneness with the first 12 chapters, and you are a scientist. You are a Christian scientist. You are principle idea. You are the idea of the principle. This is a pattern that will come up again in the platform. We'll hear it as clear as day and night, as day is from night. This coming in of what happens in that last vertical of the platform, as though to say, take everything that you have seen in the Word, the Christ, Christianity now, and be it, be that. Be that, as you are true to that, as you have been true to deducing through the Word, the Christ, Christianity, you are that. That's your being. You see, science is so simple, and the platform that looks so complex and so complicated has such a simple message, and it's going to bear out the same pattern that we see here as the relationship between chapter 13 and the first 12 chapters, that accept your oneness with the first 12 chapters. That's your principle. And then you are principle idea. Nothing can keep you from being principle idea. You are it. And that principle idea manifests itself. It manifests itself as a calculus of ideas. This is chapter 14 then, recapitulation, which is expounding now the principle through its infinite classifications, its principle expressing its ideal through a scientific system to show us what we are as principle idea, that we are a scientific system. Not that the scientific system is a scientific system, that we are scientific system. We are a calculus of ideas, and that this is a law of correction to the calculus of human beliefs, that it governs the calculus of human beliefs. And we know that that chapter is the basis of the teaching of the primary class in Christian Science, that it starts really with the great question, what on earth is God? What is God anyway? And begins with that great answer of what God is through the 7 synonymous terms and through the depicting of the 4 incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite, mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love, capitalized terms coming up. You get the pattern, the deep structure pattern of the word, of the answer to what God is, finally now in the 14th chapter, that you see now into that principle. And she says this should be the basis of the teaching of every Christian Scientist, that he sees what he is as deduced out from that definition of God, because the whole remainder of recapitulation is a great deduction through the calculus of from one point to the other out from that definition of God until all the ramifications are covered, till you have a scientific system of infinitely diversified, classified, and individual ideas, a system of metaphysics, scientific metaphysics. And so the dynamic then can move on. You notice that I said that the chapter is laid out in the calculus, that particular chapter, whereas most of the other chapters are laid out either entirely or almost entirely through the word order or the Genesis order. So we have the calculus layout in chapter 14. And then chapter 15 comes in quite naturally as Science as Christianity to show us the exalted sense of being as we begin to see what principle and idea is in their oneness. So that chapter, Genesis, is picking up the whole story and development from the preceding chapters and places emphasis on the exaltation of the creation. That principle exalts its creation within itself, that it includes its creation within itself, that in the oneness of principle and idea, creation is exalted within its divine principle. And so you have there the genesis, the forever genesis of ideas, that relationship of principle and idea is a dynamic relationship. It's not a static relationship. It doesn't go for a while and then stop. It is eternally dynamic. It is a God genesis going on, a God genesis of ideas. And that brings the whole story to its conclusion at the point of science as science, to lift now the highest standpoint of principle and idea being one to its highest standpoint as scientific understanding, where we see that really nothing is going on but principle and its idea in a oneness, but that oneness is a scientifically understood oneness. That scientific understanding is that which recognizes that nothing is going on any level except the one principle. It's a consciousness that looks at every level and sees only principle in operation. It knows no level where principle is not in operation, so that only the idea of principle is ever going on. And you have that omni-active sense, the forever active sense of the principle as it operates and is active objectively and subjectively, as Max Kapler says, where it is acting as understanding and demonstration, where understanding and demonstration are one, where objective and subjective are one, where principle and its idea is absolutely one in a dynamic, eternal relationship. That's the matrix of the Christian Science textbook, from the levels, of course, of absolute Christian Science and Christian Science,